What's on your radar, Briahna?
Well, Robbie, a shocking video emerged out of Israel this weekend that critics say confirms accusations that the country's senior leadership endorses an ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza. Now, as reported by Plus 972 magazine, in Jerusalem on Sunday, 11 Israeli cabinet members, along with 15 members of parliament, attended a conference organized by a major settler group calling for Palestinians to be removed from Gaza, all while dancing, singing, and joyfully in an unusual public sight in Israel after October 7th. The event, called Conference for Israel's Victory, prominently featured a map of proposed settlements throughout the Gaza Strip. And during the event, senior members of Israeli leadership gave remarks endorsing the Israeli settlement of Gaza and the West Bank and the permanent, quote, transfer of Palestinians out of the region. Here's Israeli Public Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir speaking to the necessity of Israel controlling Palestinian territory.
Today, everyone already understands that fleeing brings war, and that if you don't want another 7th of October, you have to return home to control the territory.
And here's Israel's finance minister, Smotrich, calling to settle the region from width to length.
We are settling our land from width to length, controlling it and fighting terror always, and bringing, with God's help, security to all of Israel. You know what the answer is. Without settlement, there is no security.
Also invited to speak at the conference was convicted Israeli terrorist Rabbi Uzi Sharboff, a settlement movement leader who was sentenced to life in prison for terror attacks in the 80s. He was released after 7 years. Opening the conference, he set the tone, arguing, quote, "Let's stop talking about parts of the land of Israel. What is A, B, and C? What is the north of the Strip? The entire Strip, the whole land, is part of the land of Israel." If there remains any confusion about the tone of the event, a pamphlet circulated at the conference argued that Palestinians should be dealt with via a, quote, Nakba 2, meaning the mass expulsion of the Arabs of Gaza. Prominent Israeli settler leader Daniela Weiss elaborated on this sentiment when asked by journalists covering the conference, saying, quote, "We don't give them food. We don't give the Arabs anything. They will have to leave. The world will accept them." Now, the actions described there, of course, constitute violations of international law. But when asked whether the ICJ ruling requiring Israel to prevent genocide may have an effect on Netanyahu's governance, Weiss seemed unconcerned, responding that, quote, "The government will accede to pressure from the public." And she might be right. A White House National Security Council spokesman responded to reports on the conference earlier this week, saying, quote, "We are troubled by statements from the conference in Jerusalem yesterday encouraging resettlement in Gaza, which was endorsed and attended by members of the government of Israel. The U.S. does not support an Israeli reoccupation of Gaza." Other Western representatives, including Canada's Trudeau and France's foreign ministry, condemned the event as well. But as America tries to distance itself rhetorically from Israeli leadership, it continues to offer Israel its full financial and political backing, no matter how explicit Israel's illegal colonial goals are. In fact, the same day that the International Court of Justice found South Africa's genocide claims, quote, plausible, and ordered Israel to take action to, quote, refrain from harming or killing Palestinians, the United States and 9 of its allies cut funding to UNRWA, the UN agency on which 2 million of the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza rely to survive. After public outcry at the somewhat flimsy basis for the cut in funding, unsubstantiated Israeli accusations that 12 out of 30,000 UNRWA staffers had participated in the October 7th attacks, Israel's story actually began to change. The Wall Street Journal beefed up its UNRWA coverage by running a story which broadened Israel's initial accusations against the 12 UNRWA workers, representing a mere 0.04% of all staff, to 10% of staffers who they claim have, quote, connections to the Hamas attack. The source of the Wall Street Journal report is an Israeli intelligence dossier. Among the connections described are, quote, close relatives with ties to Hamas. Of course, Hamas is the ruling authority in Gaza, responsible for trash pickup and social services and schools, typical of any government. To date, those connections have not been substantiated or independently investigated by our government, but one of the authors of that piece in the Wall Street Journal, Carrie Keller-Lynn, has come under scrutiny after pictures of her time serving in the IDF resurfaced. And while Israel had initially claimed its intel on UNRWA came from confessions, they changed their source to surveillance after human rights activists and journalists pointed out that Israel has caught flack in the past for using torture, and that confessions from torture are notoriously unreliable. As journalist Ryan Graham pointed out, the New York Times published Israel's new explanation without making any reference to Israel's initial claim. And most recently, Sky News reported that it had seen the Israeli intelligence, the dossier, that provided the alleged basis for Israel's claims about UNRWA staffers, and they allege only 6 UNRWA workers were involved per that document. Now, meanwhile, the latest reports out of Gaza indicate that Palestinians are eating grass and drinking polluted water as famine looms. Per the words of settler leader Daniela Weiss, that's the plan. During her speech at the settler conference, Weiss said, quote, "Gaza, the southern gate to Israel, will be wide open. Gazans will leave for all parts of the world, and the Jewish people will make the land of our forefathers flourish. Each and every clod of the land of Israel that our soldiers have within their grasp gives us the necessary strength to fight against a cruel and eternal enemy. It is not to a foreign land that we are returning, but rather to the golden sands of our Gaza. There is no day after. The day is today. It's every day in which the Jewish people is victorious and returns to settle in Gaza." Despite the goal articulated at the conference of using famine to drive Palestinians out of Gaza, the White House stood by its decision to cut aid.
We absolutely share the concerns about the humanitarian crisis that's in Gaza right now. Certainly we know that severe hunger is one of those issues, which is why we're working so hard to get more security assistance into the people of Gaza, which is why it's so important that these discussions that we've been having about an extended pause actually come to fruition. Because it is primarily about getting those hostages out, of course, but it also will give you a longer opportunity to increase that aid. So absolutely we're concerned about that, no question about it. Now look, we suspended funding temporarily to UNRWA as they do this investigation. We believe it was the right thing to do to stop that funding while they investigate, and we'll see how that investigation goes.
Now, given the life-saving nature of UNRWA and the fact that the people alleged to be involved were immediately terminated, one could easily imagine continuing the funding while the investigation took place rather than punishing Palestinians for an investigation that has not yet borne fruit. And there has been admissions in the past that UNRWA is as important as I'm describing it here. For contrast, here's State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller responding to Israeli accusations that UNRWA fosters Hamas just about a week before the ICJ decision.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Matt. In light of a January 9 Israel Knesset member-led meeting in the Knesset condemning the UN agency, UNRWA, for fostering a welfare-dependent Palestinian population that breeds dissent and teaches children in their textbooks that the land is Palestine and Israel is the illegal occupier, with other instruction to hate and kill Jews, plus their association with terrorist groups like Hamas and Palestinian Authority. What is Secretary Blinken's response to Knesset members Sharon Haskell and Simcha Rotman, who are calling for the funding of UNRWA to stop? And I have a follow-up.
So I'm not going to respond to the comments by individual members of the Knesset, but I will say that UNRWA has done and continues to do invaluable work to address the humanitarian situation in Gaza at great personal risk to UNRWA members. I believe it's over 100 UNRWA staff members have been killed doing this life-saving work, and we continue to not only support it, but we continue to commend them for the really heroic efforts that they make oftentimes while making the greatest sacrifice.
Invaluable work, the greatest sacrifice. What a difference a week and an ICJ decision makes. While America defends its support of Israel, citing shared day-after goals of a two-state solution, Israeli leaders repeatedly reject that outcome. At the conference, Communications Minister Shlomo Kari insisted, quote, "There will never be a Palestinian state between the river and the sea. We have an obligation to act for our sake and for the sake of the supposedly uninvolved for voluntary migration, even if the war that was forced upon us turns the issue of voluntary migration into coercion to the point that they say, 'I want to leave.'" Remember that last year the Senate passed a resolution stipulating that the phrase "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" and its variations are anti-Semitic calls for genocide. And the House censured Representative Rashida Tlaib for using that slogan. None of that same censorship coming for very similar statements coming out of Israeli leadership. Meanwhile, at Saturday's Jerusalem conference, families who had signed up to resettle Gaza were invited up onto the stage and celebrated. A map demonstrating new locations for settlements in Gaza, offering new names for sites on which Palestinian cities currently stand, or at least where they stood prior to being obliterated by Israel post-October 7th, was prominently featured. The conference featured a booth where attendees could register as an interested settler. Of course, Israeli settlements of occupied Palestinian land are illegal under international law. As Article 49 of the Geneva Convention states, the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies, and precludes individual or mass forcible transfers, as well as deportations of protected persons from an occupied territory. According to Plus 972 reporting, the idea of transferring Gaza's Palestinian population was mentioned in nearly every speech at the Jerusalem conference. In the words of National Security Minister Ben-Gvir, quote, "only transfer will bring peace." Oh, and in case you were wondering what Ben-Gvir's response to the ICJ judgment at The Hague was explicitly, he tweeted, "The Hague schmeg." The United States continues to affirm that Israel is one of our closest allies. Currently, a $14.3 billion aid package is pending before Congress. That's the background of all that's been going on. So with new reporting that came out today that Joe Biden is interested in his two-state solution, he is seemingly moving to address the settler attacks on Palestinians that have been happening in the West Bank. Again, not where there's Hamas, but in the West Bank as opposed to in Gaza. It does seem like there's some recognition that the crimes that are being committed, the war crimes that are being committed, are so loud and so obvious, including exemplified by what happened at this conference, that it seems the administration is forced to say something. But I do think there's still a lot of doubt about how far Biden is willing to go to curb this activity if at the end of the day, the public critique is not tied to any withdrawal of aid to Israel, even at the same time that there was such quick withdrawal of aid to UNRWA.
Yeah, it wasn't just the U.S., the U.K., France as well criticized this conference and the involvement in some of Netanyahu's allies being there. I mean, I think the question does become, if we're giving them all this support and we remain vocally committed to them, but they don't do anything we tell them to do. They don't take our advice to de-escalate, and Biden says he wants a two-state solution. Netanyahu utterly rejects that. Netanyahu has said they're not going to permanently occupy Gaza, but there's some confusion over that. Obviously, some of his supporters do want that. I think it's
his cabinet members,
right? I think it's an indictment of Joe Biden that, again, if the purpose of our dollar diplomacy is supposedly to get policy preferences that we want implemented. So if we think it's in our best national security interest for there to be a two-state and for there to be an end to hostilities between these two parties, I mean, an elimination of Hamas ideally, but an end to the constant war there, and that's what we're trying to get, and we don't agree with what they're doing, but we're going to give them the money anyway. What's the point? It seems like, again, the American taxpayer on the hook for everything, not getting what our leaders say is in our best national security interests, and it's very frustrating.
And American troops' lives being implicated as well as escalation spreads across the Middle East. We'll keep covering this and more. Stick with us. More Rising after this.